And you did get the instructions to, if you're going to use both audio and video for this meeting, please use your phone for audio. That's going to reduce the echo effect for anybody who's logging in. You have dial-in information for your audio, and you will use the Skype, you've probably already done this, but Skype connection online that came in the calendar appointment. Please don't use the Skype audio function if you can at all avoid it, because that will add feedback to our call and make it difficult to understand our presenters. Instead, on your telephone, please mute us so that everybody can hear the speakers, but avoid putting us on hold, because then we will all be treated to your hold music while you're on hold. I'm muted. We're going to be, look, somebody just put us on hold. We'll be taking all audience questions through the chat function of Skype. So if you have questions as we're going along, please send them into the chat function. I'll be tracking those for the speakers. And when we pause for questions, we'll get in as many of the questions as we can. This webinar is being recorded, and as soon as we can get it up on the website, it will be available to all of you to re-listen to, look at the slides and things like that. So moving on to the next slide, I'll introduce our presenters for today. We have Barbara Chanko, who is a member of the ASBH SECA committee, and Trevor Bibler, who is also a member of the committee and who actually did receive his HEC-C in the first certification window. So Barbara and Trevor, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you.
And Barbara, can you hear us?
Yes, hi everyone.
Oh, great.
I hope everyone can see the title slide of the presentation. If not, please let us know in the chat. In this hour that we're together, Trevor Bibler and I, on behalf of the Clinical Ethics Consultation Advisory, or SECA Committee, will tell you about the Healthcare Ethics Certification Examination and how you can prepare to take the exam, and then we'll practice some sample questions together. Please feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll respond to them as we can. The purpose of this session is to give you information necessary to prepare for the exam. I'm going to start off by reviewing the resources that the Healthcare Ethics Consultation Certification Commission has developed and how they support the examination preparation. Then we'll take a look at the resources available through ASBH, including the practice exam. Finally, we'll review sample questions that reflect what you'll find on the practice exam and the actual exam. Before I get started, I wanted to point out some important dates and deadlines for those who are considering taking the examination. There are two planned test windows, and you can see them there on the slide, in May of this year and then later in November. There's still plenty of time before the March 10th deadline to submit your application for the May test, and even more time to apply for the November test. The Healthcare Ethics Consultation Certification Commission is comprised of experts and leaders in clinical healthcare ethics consultation and responsible for the certification examination. The Commission developed the essential elements of a certification program, including the selection of Castle Testing Company to create and host the exam, selecting item writers for the entry-level exam that's based on the role delineation study, which we'll talk about in a bit, determining eligibility criteria, and developing policies and procedures to guide the Commission's work. The Commission produced the Candidate Handbook, which contains the information you will need to apply for the Healthcare Ethics Consultation Certification Examination. The Commission made publicly available the content outline for the examination, which was used by the volunteer item writers who developed the questions for which the certification examination, and also made publicly available the 14 core references that are used for the item writing. The full content outline and the core references are listed at the web address on this slide, along with sample questions.
Barbara, I'm sorry. It looks like we might be having some problems with the slide. What slide number are you on?
I am on slide 6.
Okay, and are you moving the slides on your own?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. If we have problems, I'll pipe in and let you know.
Are you able to see slide 6 now? It says the candidate handbook?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a little bit more detail about the contents of the candidate handbook. The handbook contains all the nuts and bolts about the examination. It lists the dates and deadlines, provides information about the application, exam policies, the application process, and the specifics about when, where, and how one takes the exam. It also explains how the scoring is performed and describes the exam format. Again, all candidates are strongly encouraged to review this information prior to applying for the examination. I've moved to the next slide. So what is the Healthcare Ethics Consultation Certification Examination Content Outline? I know it's a mouthful, but what is it and why is it so important? In 2017, the ASBH task force worked with healthcare ethics consultants to delineate critical job components using a number of methods, including interviews, surveys, observation, and group discussions. That effort resulted in the ASBH role delineation study. The role delineation study incorporated feedback from 905 practicing healthcare ethics consultants. It carefully outlines core components involved in healthcare ethics consultation practice and became the key document used to create the exam content outline. The content outline is a guide to the concepts and knowledge that will be tested through the examination. It's divided into the following 4 domains with associated tasks: assessment, analysis, process, and quality. It also includes 63 knowledge statements that represent foundational knowledge based on the role delineation study. Practically speaking, each exam question relates to a domain, task, and knowledge statement included in the exam content outline. The number of questions on each domain on the exam is based on the weighing of each domain in the outline. So for example, 32% of the questions are related to the domain of assessment, while 13% of the questions are related to evaluation and quality improvement. While there are any numbers of ethics references in our own personal libraries, the answers to the commission-created exam questions had to be supported by one or more of the 14 core references listed at the end of the examination content outline. Understanding the content of the exam by reviewing the content outline is an important step for any person preparing for the examination. If you're planning to take the examination, you should definitely go to the website and use the content outline and the 14 core references to prepare. Let's talk a minute about the sample questions. We've noted that sample questions have been provided by the Commission. It's important to spend a moment to consider what the sample questions are and what they are not. The sample questions were developed by practice exam item writers, not the item writers of the actual exam. So there were 2 groups of writers: practice exam item writers and exam writers. Someone's phone is not on mute. Please mute your phones. Please mute your phones. Thank you. The practice test exam item writers were trained like the exam writers but the actual exam questions went through several stages of review and validation prior to appearing on the exam that did not occur with the practice questions. The sample questions that are on the website were drawn from a pool of surplus items not selected for the practice examination that's available through ASBH. They provide samples of questions, of the types of questions and the structure of the questions that you'll encounter on the examination. However, they are not excess questions from the actual exam. Sometimes people think that the questions are excess questions from the actual exam, but they are not. Okay. On this slide, you'll see some images of familiar resources that are available through ASBH. You probably recognize the pink and black book called The Core Competencies in Healthcare Ethics Consultation, 2nd edition, and perhaps the blue book, Improving Competencies in Clinical Ethics Consultation, also in its 2nd edition. The newest item is the green and blue book entitled A Case-Based Study Guide for Addressing Patient-Centered Ethical Issues in Healthcare. This publication was released in 2017. It uses an in-depth discussions of paradigmatic case consultations to complement the blue book, Improving Competencies in Clinical Ethics Consultation. Each one of these is one of the 14 resources that support the questions and the responses on the examination. So also available through ASBH is actually the Healthcare Ethics Consultation Certification Practice Exam. So let me describe that a bit. This is a resource that was developed by our committee, the HEC-C committee, as an online practice examination with questions similar in type to those that will be found on the actual examination. We use the publicly available certification examination content outline and core references to develop practice questions that are similar in format to those that will appear on the exam. The questions on the practice exam are targeted to those eligible to sit for the exam. That is, a person who at a minimum has a bachelor's degree with 400 hours of ethics experience over the past 4 years. The questions focus on key knowledge and skills described in the content outline. The questions are multiple choice and have 4 response options, where there is only one best correct answer, but other options may be possible. There is no use of an all of the above or none of the above response in any of the questions, and the answers to each question has at least one reference from one of the 4 core references associated with the answer. Also, there are no trick questions. And again, just to reemphasize, the practice exam writers were oriented and trained by Castle Testing Company and followed a similar question development process as the actual exam writers for the test, but neither group shared their questions with the other group. And certainly no one from HEC-C, unless they've taken the exam, has actually seen the questions on the exam. When you take the practice exam online, you'll find 50 questions in both standalone and scenario-based formats. When you submit your practice exam for scoring, a diagnostic report will be provided that will contain for each question the correct answer, the rationale and references, additional recommended reading, and a mapping to the exam content outline, which will help you determine content for further study. It's very important that anyone choosing to take the practice exam realize that success on the practice exam does not guarantee positive results on the certification examination. This may be a bit redundant at this point, but it's important to point out again that HEC-C members who wrote practice questions had no contact with the commission or the examination writers, nor have we seen the actual exam items as a committee. We did use the publicly available content outline, knowledge statements, and core references to develop the practice test. So I'm going to see now if there are any questions in the chat, any comments in the chat. For some reason, I can't see the chat. Are there any questions in the chat?
We haven't received any yet.
Okay. So why don't we move on then and begin looking at some of the sample questions. So I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Trevor Bibler, to review some of the questions that we've put together on the screens here for you all today. Trevor?
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. I appreciate that. So what we're going to do now then, as Barbara said, is look over a couple sample questions. And with each question, we'll have an answer. It'll either be a standalone question. I believe somebody's getting a call right now. If you don't mind declining that or sending that to voicemail, that'd be great. I think there's a beeping, as somebody in the chat has pointed out. But anyway, I'll continue moving forward with that until we're able to take care of that. But there'll be an answer to the question. We'll talk about the rationale, and then we'll go through the references, both the domain, the task, and the knowledge statement, and the citation itself. So let's just jump in. What I'll do is I'll read the question, and then I'll pause to let everybody read through the answers on their own. And then whatever they think is the correct answer, if you don't mind putting that into the text chat itself, we can leave a little bit of time for that and kind of see what people are thinking. So first question here, what type of organ donation activity is ethically and legally prohibited in the United States? Okay, for this one, it looks like we're getting a whole lot of answer D, donation for compensation. And that's the correct answer. The correct answer is D, donation for compensation. In terms of the rationale itself, we begin with a quote here. In the United States, as well as other countries, buying and selling of organs is illegal. Payment for organs is considered impermissible because this practice is felt to create an incentive that compromises the voluntary nature of organ donation. Organ donation in the U.S. remains grounded in the ethical principle of altruism, and the payment for organs is felt to create a coercive dynamic that would undermine the careful consideration of the risks an organ donor accepts in order to help the other person. Reimbursement for donor expenses, such as medical expenses or income lost due to time away from work, is allowable because these reimbursements do not result in a financial gain, and thus are not felt to create a coercive incentive. The answer A, which was solicitation online, is not prohibited. The answer B, donation to incarcerated persons, is an area of controversy, but is not ethically or legally prohibited. And answer C, directed living donation, is common and permissible, especially in the practice for kidney and liver donation. So then, in terms of the references, the domain that we're discussing here is the domain of assessment of the four. The task here is identifying the ethical concerns and the central ethical questions. And the knowledge statement is K18, organ donation and transplantation. Our reference citation itself is from Bernard Lowe's 2013 book, Resolving Ethical Dilemmas, A Guide for Clinicians edition. And specifically, that's on page 298. So then at this point, I'll pause to see if we have any additional questions. Doesn't appear to be the case. It does appear to be that the beeping has stopped, so I appreciate that. If there's no questions at this point, feel free to feel free to type those in as we move along further, and Mary Beth and Barbara and I will try to answer those as they come up. But given that, I say we move on to one of our scenario-based case presentations and questions. It will include a number of questions. I believe we have 3 or 4 questions based on this scenario and the scenario as they develop. So our first case, a 71-year-old woman is hospitalized in the ICU with acute respiratory failure requiring mechanical ventilation and sedation. She has a long history of emphysema requiring long-term oxygen therapy, in addition to peripheral vascular disease and stable angina pectoris. She was admitted a week ago for mild respiratory distress. In conversation with her husband and the physician during that admission, she voiced that she did not want life support treatment, including intubation, due to her poor quality of life. The physician documented the decision and placed a DNAR order in the hospital chart. She was subsequently discharged home with no order and forced limiting treatment. Today, when she developed trouble breathing at home and passed out, her husband called 911 and insisted that paramedics intubate her on arrival to their home. The paramedics complied with this request. Now in the ICU, her husband is insisting that she continue to receive aggressive life-sustaining treatment. The patient herself does not have decisional capacity. The medical care team calls for an ethics consult, requesting support for the continuation of the DNAR order. So our first question. In response to the request for the consult, the healthcare ethics consultant should All right. I'm seeing quite a bit of C. I'll move on in just a second. Alrighty, I see most people selected C, and that's the correct answer. Discuss the reason for an ethics consult with the medical team and set reasonable expectations for the consult. So in terms of the rationale for that, the ethics consultant recognizes that in such situations, it's important to methodically and thoroughly consider the facts of the case in order to make optimal decisions and treatment choices. While the requester asked for the ethics consult in order to, quote, support the continuation of the DNAR, end quote, the ethics consultant must clarify the ethical question and provide reasonable expectations for the consultation. For example, it may be determined that the ethical questions are, what are the patient's wishes, and what is the role and perspective of her husband? This would change the expectation from support for the presumption of the medical staff to assistance in determining the wishes of the patient and supporting her autonomous values and preferences. Certainly, it must be made clear that the ethics consultant will not simply serve as a rubber stamp at this point for the judgment of the medical team. Determining the appropriateness of an ethics consultation, as well as the involvement of other resources, is essential. Requests that do not have ethical considerations or that have additional dimensions should be referred to appropriate institutional resources for their expertise. Such referrals may include pastoral care, palliative care, risk management, hospital counsel, social work, security, so on. As in this case, it can be appropriate to conduct an ethics consultation, as well as enlist resources with expertise in the DNAR policies of the hospital or with expertise in the laws of the state. Recruiting someone as well with expertise in mediation skills, if the consultant herself is not sufficiently confident in these skills, may also be valuable in working with the patient's family. So, the content outline domain itself would be assessment. Thank you. In terms of the task, we'd look at number 6, identifying the ethical concerns and central ethical questions. Regarding the knowledge statement, one of them it would be local healthcare organization and policies, and healthcare ethics consultant resources and relationships. Our main reference for that would be Johnson et al.'s 8th edition of their clinical ethics book, specifically pages 33 through 45. And then then there's additional reading as well. Hester Schoenfeld's guidance for ethics committees, 32 through 40. The core competencies, pages 4, 7, 10, and 12. And then the improving competencies book as well, pages 72 through 73. Before going on with the case any farther, have we had any questions yet?
We did get one question, Trevor. How do you recommend best using the core references to study other than reading them all cover to cover?
Oh, oh yeah, no, that's a great question. I can't speak for members of the committee, but I can speak for myself. I can give a little guidance as to how I went through the process. So I'm at Baylor College of Medicine, and what our ethics faculty and senior fellows decided to do is that we actually decided to divvy up the 14 core competencies. And then we each took a certain number of them. And then what we did for each of them is we created a template that we as individual researchers and scholars kind of filled out, and it went from everything from surprising points of practice to areas that we thought might be on the exam to basic assessment, analysis, quality process stuff. And we kind of created an outline and a table of contents. We often relied on tables of contents, and then we met every 2 weeks or so, or maybe every 1 week. Now that I say that aloud, we met every 1 week, and then went through each of the person's presentation. They presented for about an hour on each of the core references. For some of the shorter references, it was a bit shorter, but overall, rather than just every member of our group sitting down to read all 14 core references, that was the approach we ended up taking. That might be a little helpful. Obviously, we all had some we had different familiarities with different areas. Like, for example, the DICOMA textbook on pediatric ethics. Since we do primarily adult ethics, none of us had really read through that one in detail. So that was a good one that we paid special attention to, and so on.
And Trevor, if you don't mind, I'll just add.
Yeah, please.
I think, again, I would refer folks back to the content outline and the knowledge statements that are related to it, because I think that gives you a very good idea, obviously, of what's going to be on the exam, and that you can make sure to focus on areas that you may feel like you don't have enough experience with or want a refresher on. And then I think, another tool for that, some may use this and some may not, is using the practice exam in the manner to take it, see how you do, and see which areas and which references, you'll get a report back on your experience, much like you're seeing here, and you'd be able to see which references you may need to be able to spend some extra time with.
Hi, and this is Barbara. I've actually not taken the exam myself, but I know people who have, and I think besides reading the references, they've actually tried to actively use them in ethics consultation. So part of a certification examination, I think, is continuous improvement and enrichment of what we know or what we think we know, validating what we think we know, and using it in practice. So I would say people should look at those references and put them into practice as you can, as they're relevant to your circumstances. And again, certain of them, like the core competencies document, that's basically laying out what we think core competencies ought to be for ethics consultants. And then the other two guides that are listed there, they really support building knowledge, skills, and competency in each of those areas. So I think that there's a lot of richness in the resources that are there for people to just bring into practice, whether they take the exam or not, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just to let everyone know, I'm having trouble. I was knocked off the network, so I'm trying to get back in, but I can't see the slides. But I'll just continue on with just my listening.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you both, Mary Beth and Barbara, for that. Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly endorse both aspects of both Mary Beth's point about using the available resources and Barbara's point about using the resources, using the core references as part of practice, actually being as conscientious as possible about bringing those into practice as well. I think that's really great advice. Okay, so then our next question, using the exact same scenario, is after discussing and setting expectations, what is the next best step for the healthcare ethics consultant? Alrighty, a few more seconds. Great, most people are saying C. Let's now go to the answer. The correct answer is C. Meet with the patient's husband to determine why he objects to the DNAR order. As is often and aptly said, good ethics begins with good facts. The consultant must begin with an assessment of the situation before a proper analysis can be conducted and recommendations be made. Information sources must be identified, relevant medical records must be reviewed, perspectives of stakeholders must be elicited, a balanced narrative of the case must be constructed. In order to elicit the perspectives of stakeholders, in this case the husband's perspective, I think is central, the following abilities are needed. The ability to ask open-ended and specific questions, even of those reluctant to speak, elicit facts and opinions in a non-judgmental manner related to topics, even related to topics such as religion, cultural background, family social structure, differences in education, discerning patient values, assisting clarifying values and preferences, and help marginalized individuals freely express themselves. In this particular case, important information was gleaned from the meeting with the patient's husband. While at home, after extensive discussions with her husband and children, the patient decided that she wanted to live until the birth of her first grandchild, which was expected within the month, even if that meant aggressive hospital treatment. Multiple family members and friends subsequently corroborated the content of these discussions. Sometimes, as in this case, the information gathering phase leads to resolution of an ethical question and clarification of recommendations. In other cases, it may set the stage for more structured conversation between key stakeholders. So, there we see the answer, the rationale. In terms of the content outline domain itself, it is assessment. In terms of the task, it's gather and discerning factual information that's relevant to the case. The knowledge statement itself, advanced care planning, KO2. Regarding the reference is Fletcher's Introduction to Clinical Ethics from 2005, specifically the pages 212 to 233. And then we also suggest additional further reading from the core competencies, pages 12 to 13, and then from the Improving Competencies Manual, pages 73 through 79. So since I don't believe we've had any additional questions at this point, let's introduce the final question for this scenario-based series of questions. So the underlying ethical standard guiding the consultant's analysis of this case is Okay, a few more seconds. All right, it looks like with this one we're getting a little bit more of a mix between A and C primarily. So the correct answer is A, substituted judgment. So while this case is an example of surrogate decision-making is not an ethical standard for decision-making. Surrogate decision-making refers to the process of making decisions for patients who lack decisional capacity. A surrogate is anyone who makes decisions for an incapacitated patient. So then what are our standards we're talking about here? The three ethical standards that guide surrogate decision-making, the process, are first, the patient's previously stated explicit wishes, which can be oral or written. Second, substituted judgment, the correct answer. And three, the best interest standard. If the patient's wishes are explicitly known, then her autonomy is respected by following them. Substituted judgment, which is also based on respect for patient's autonomy, bases moral questions on what the patient herself would have chosen if she could make the decision. The question to ask is, what would be the patient's preference if she could speak? The best interest standard is used when the preferences of the patient are unknown or simply unknowable. The best interest standard is based on the ethical concepts of beneficence and non-maleficence. In short, it asks decision makers to consider the burdens and benefits of the treatment alternatives and select the option that maximizes benefits over burdens in the context of what is known about the patient's values and life experiences. So, this domain is the domain of analysis. The task, again, being clarifying relevant ethical issues. The knowledge statement, KO3, autonomy, informed consent, and informed refusal. Our reference is again from Fletcher's Introduction to Clinical Ethics, pages 212 through 233, with further reading being found in Lowe's Resolving Ethical Dilemmas, pages 99 through 110, Johnson et al.'s Clinical Ethics, pages 93 through 97, and finally, the Improving Competencies book by ASBH, pages 27 through 33. All right. Then if there are any additional questions, I'll pause for a second here. If not, we'll move on to our last sample question, and we'll have plenty of time for additional questions if they occur to you as we go through this one or any previous ones. So here's our question. A nephrologist's outpatient practice is a study site for placebo-controlled safety and efficacy trial of a study medication designed to treat hyperkalemia, a potassium disorder common in people with kidney disease. A patient meeting the inclusion criteria for the study arrives for a scheduled medical appointment. During the visit, the nephrologist invites the patient to volunteer as a research subject in this study. The physician explains the study and touches upon all of the necessary elements of informed consent. The patient indicates that he agrees to participate in the study. The patient is accompanied by his adult daughter for today's visit. After listening to the informed consent discussion, she asks her father why he thought the physician invited him to participate in the research study. The patient responds, "Because he thinks the medication will help my kidneys." The patient's understanding of the reason his nephrologist invited him to enroll in the research trial is an example of which of the following? Alrighty, one more second. Alrighty. Yep. Looks like we got a lot of A as the answer, and that's the correct answer, therapeutic misconception. So during the informed consent process for research, investigators have an ethical duty to provide information about the study that makes it clear to the patient that he would be a research subject while participating in the study, and that the purpose of research is not to improve his own care, but to generate generalizable knowledge. Some people can appreciate that the protocol is research and not an effective treatment being recommended specifically to improve their own health status. Or they may overestimate the possibility for improvement, or may be overly optimistic about their own chances that the protocol will make a positive difference. These latter two states are acceptable, but the existence of a therapeutic misconception is not. The investigator has a duty to address and resolve a patient's therapeutic misconception and not permit him to participate. So here, regarding the content outline domain, we have evaluation and QI, quality improvement, task related to recommending policy and practice changes within the organization, and knowledge statement related to autonomy, informed consent, and refusal. So some of our references here: Beecham and Childress's principles, Bernard Lowe's resolving ethical dilemmas, and then finally the core competencies for healthcare ethics consultation as well. All of these resources would be able to address this idea of therapeutic misconception and the healthcare ethicist response in this situation. So then, at this point, we can pause for any additional questions that might come up, but as we're doing that, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody for participating and gamely answering our multiple choice questions. If you have additional questions about the exam itself, you can always feel free to contact Certification Commission, either at the phone number that you see in front of you, or via email at cert@asbh.org. Or if you have additional questions about the study resources, you can feel free to contact ASBH at that same phone number, or via email at info@asbh.org. So Mary Beth, was there any additional questions that we missed?
I'm not seeing any, but we can take a few minutes if people have any at the end of the call, if you'd like to add something or ask something or make a comment.
Hi, this is Barbara. So I just wanted to point out something that I realize we don't really have emphasized in our notes about the practice exam, and specifically about the rationale. And I hope that people have been able through these examples to appreciate that when we did this, when we created the questions and then the answers and the rationale, we not only tried to explain in the rationale why the correct answer was correct, but also to point out why the other choices were either wrong or not the best correct answer. And so in a way, we try to use this practice exam as a way to reinforce other points beyond those that were being made by the specific question. And so the example of the very first question, I think, is a good example of that, where we talk not only about what was legal in terms of all those things that are legal in terms of organ donation, but also what's not legal, what's impermissible in the United States. So in some ways, people will get sort of like 4 information sound bites in every question, even if there's only one question there. And then they can use those questions to say, hey, I really didn't know that much about what goes on in the prison system, and you could learn something about that to expand your knowledge.
And we did get a question about getting a copy of the slides. So we are recording this session, and I will make sure that each of you get a recording, and then the recording will also be made available at some point on the ASBH website. One thing I'd like to add to what Barbara and Trevor are saying that we have been working on with CCON when looking at all of these resources. I think one of the tenets that we're going for is that, with this exam, there has been some questions of how well can you measure the practice of a of a healthcare ethics consultant with an exam, but this is a step in professionalizing and standardizing some practice. So really, one thing to consider when you're taking the exam is that the right answer, what the exam is looking for, is the best answer, and the answer that is supported by the core references, not necessarily your answer of how you do it. It's really based on that standard that's set out in the core references. So that's just a note to keep in mind while you're studying, that we know that different people have some different approaches to practice, and of course we can't test for all of those, but the standard that we're looking for is laid out in those core references. Any other questions? Any feedback about this webinar? We're going to be doing it again next week, so if you have feedback, certainly feel free to include that as well. Great. All right, and I can leave this window open for a little while if people want to send other questions as we just continue the audio, but it looks like we may be ready to wrap up. All right, well, thank you, Barbara and Trevor, for all of your work on this and for getting this pulled together, and thank you all for your participation and doing so through the chat and keeping phones off hold and on mute, and we really appreciate your participation. So thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Trevor?
Yes?
Yes, hello?
Hello,
It's
Barbara's here.
And Ellen, I was wondering if we would have an opportunity just to chat for a few minutes.
I hope
Hi,
so.
this is Jane. You guys did a great job.
I would say so. I would agree.
Okay,
Really
good.
Good.
Wonderful.
So, Ellen, just so you know, I wrote notes for all my sections, so I'll send them if anyone wants.
I was thinking to myself, wow, are you fluent with all of it? And
well, I have to say that by writing the notes, it really sort of helped me understand things a little bit better, and I also went to the website, and that helped me understand things better. So, in order to teach, you have to know. So I think it did help me to do that. But I'll share these so that you'll have my notes, and you can rip off of them or reuse them or whatever you like. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that was great. I reviewed the slides early this week when I got back to town.